Hello and welcome. Today I am reviewing Beowulf, or more specifically, 3 different versions of Beowulf. The first, written by Michael Morpurgo and illustrated by Michael Foreman, was published in 2006. The second is Marc Hudson's translation, which bizarrely carries no date. And the third is Seamus Heaney's translation from 1999. For the unaware, Beowulf was written in Old English around 1000 AD and is one of the earliest written texts in that language. It is probably based on a Germanic myth that may date from up to 500 years earlier. Now, the story follows the eponymous hero through 3 adventures. The first is probably the most famous. In Denmark, the king Hrothgar has built a giant hall called Heorot that is the pride of the kingdom and attracts a great deal of revelry that in turn attracts a monster called Grendel. For 12 years, Grendel performs nightly raids on the giant hall and the surrounding areas. Such is the chaos that word reaches across the sea to Beowulf, son of the king Hygelac of the Geats. He travels to Denmark in order to win some glory for himself, but also because Hrothgar had been the sole lord to offer sanctuary to his father when he was in trouble. Beowulf and his retainers reach Heorot, where he announces that he will face Grendel unarmed, as the monster too relies purely on its own considerable strength. Hrothgar agrees. After all, it's no skin off his delicious bones if Beowulf is the one that gets eaten. In the night, Grendel bursts in, scoffs down one man, and is grabbed by Beowulf in an armlock. In his attempts to escape, Grendel's arm is ripped from his body by Beowulf, and though he manages to leave Heorot, his injury is mortal. The celebrations, though lavish, are cut short when Grendel's mother attacks and kills one of Hrothgar's best and oldest friends. Hrothgar and Beowulf whip up a search party and set off in pursuit. They discover their old friend's head at the shore of a lake that's infested by monsters, and Beowulf sets off in pursuit, armed with Hrunting, a sword borrowed from Unferth, one of Hrothgar's men. After fighting off a sea beast and swimming for almost an entire day towards the lake's deep bottom, Beowulf is grabbed by Grendel's mother, who drags him into her lair, and the two fight. Hrunting is unable to damage Grendel's mother, but luckily there is another giant sword to hand, which he grabs and uses to cut off her head. He then discovers Grendel's body and cuts the head off of that as well, the sword blade dissolving in his corrosive blood. He takes hilt and head to Hrothgar, whose men had mostly drifted away, believing Beowulf lost. After a celebration, Beowulf is rewarded with great treasure and heads back to home in Hygelac. He shares his treasure and wisdom with his uncle and is considered a king in waiting, which duly comes to pass after Hygelac and much of his family are lost in battle. After ruling for 55 years and now an old man, Beowulf's kingdom is suddenly beset by a dragon unleashed by a runaway slave stealing a golden cup from his hoard. Beowulf, knowing that his time is near, gathers his retinue and goes to fight the fire breather. However, when push comes to warming shove, his men break and run, leaving him alone. His sword, though, is unable to do sufficient damage to the dragon, and it looks like all is lost. However, one young warrior, Wiglaf, rushes to join the fight, and together they do kill the dragon, but not before it takes a bite out of Beowulf and leaves him dying. After Wiglaf shows Beowulf some of the treasure he has won for his people, Beowulf dies, leaving his men to wonder what will happen now the great king and his fearsome reputation are no longer there to protect them from the Franks and Swedes that gather on their borders. The 3 texts take slightly different approaches to the actual poem. Morpurgo's version is aimed at the youngest audience, probably aged 8 to 12. As we will see, there is some gore that perhaps parents would rather shelter younger children from, though likely those same children would rather enjoy the more gruesome aspects of it. The scene where Grendel attacks represents the worst of this. A night of gore and gluttonous pleasure lay ahead of him, or so it seemed, and so it began too, as he snatched up the first Geatish sentry he saw. Hanskio he was called, and he simply tore him apart, bolting his flesh in great gobbets, gnawing and gnashing on his bones, stripping the meat, sucking the veins, until in moments nothing of the poor helpless man was left, not a hair on his head, not a hand, not a foot, not even a nail. For contrast, on your screen now are how Hudson and Heaney respectively deal with the same scene. Morpurgo also presents his text mostly as prose. I say mostly because Beowulf, when written in Old English, would have had a very distinct metre, mostly based around alliterative stressed syllables. Here's an example, the first page of the text from Heaney's version, which is the only one of the 3 to include any Old English at all, and even then only this one page. Now, I can't read Old English, but roughly how the metre and the alliteration works is that each line is split into a half line, sometimes by caesura, sometimes not. Each half line has 2 stressed syllables and up to 6 syllables that are not stressed. 2 or 3 of the stressed syllables will be alliterative, but the 4th never does. Morpurgo forgoes most of that, offering the poem as prose, but prose that occasionally is heavily alliterative, as in these examples. Brave Beowulf battles with the forces of darkness, first with that foul fiend Grendel, then with the sea hag of a mother, and last of all with the death dragon of the deep. His text also has short lines, though whether that is a nod to Anglo-Saxon conventions or a concession to his youthful audience is not explained. However, while the text unsurprisingly is well paced and easy to read, its stylistic and structural hangovers from the poetry make this somewhat odd to read anyway. I'm unsure if this will be the gateway to heroic fantasy the author hopes, or if it will instead just rather put young people off. Given the widespread changes that have been made, it might simply have made more sense to go the whole way and present this as a modern prose retelling, downplaying the Saxon in order to make the book a more accessible read for the texting generation. That said, the illustrations that it contains are rather in the vein of horrible histories, and I can see some crossover in audience there, if not with the more mature fare of the genre or an attractiveness to those beyond the reach of the histories. Perhaps surprisingly, in the modern era, Morpurgo's version also plays up the Christian aspects of the text, and the glory to God exclamations of the original poet feel even more frequent when the book is stripped of the asides and digressions of the main text. Though stripping the text down to the bare bones does strip the book of some of its intertextuality, that is one of the more interesting parts of the original poem, and we will look at that in more detail later. If purely done for streamlining, it would likely be a positive for an audience more interested in bedtime reading than university study, but to then fill the void that you create by doing that with an increase in the Christian message, while laudable to some, is that some the intended audience? I suspect Beowulf, which is ultimately a pagan text underneath the Christian makeup, is unlikely to appear on many church reading lists. Ultimately, one of the most fascinating aspects of this book is its position among the border of the pagan and the Christian mythos. As Tolkien puts it, this is the great pagan on the threshold of the change of the world. Beowulf charts that transition beneath its surface of heroes and monsters. The old gods, probably the Saxon Wotan or Norse Odin, are erased. The Christian spirituality and morality is pushed into the spaces that creates, but where they fit the worst, the text is more interesting for it. And here, no doubt, we find the hopeful historian gnashing his teeth and wondering what might have been. The Germanic warrior culture, governed by a code of honour around the pursuit of fame based on prowess with a weapon, remains prevalent in Beowulf. Concerns about the afterlife, then, become little more than lip service. Seamus Heaney's version is the most overt, with Beowulf bolstering the courage of a flagging Hrothgar with the following inspiration: "For every one of us living in the world means waiting for our end. Let whoever can win glory before death. When a warrior is gone, that'll be his best and only bulwark." Morpurgo's offering is somewhat different. For a fighting man like me, daring is everything. How else will a fighting man be remembered if he does not dare? Which I think is a shame. A shame because it underestimates his audience's interest in the old gods, whatever flavour you allocate them, but it also misrepresents Beowulf as a more mindless fighter than is fair. So Morpurgo's book embraces the Christian a little more than his peers, particularly Heaney, and when Beowulf relates his successes to Hygelac, Morpurgo refers to Grendel and his mother as Satan's children, a comparison absent from the other versions. And at the book's end, when Beowulf is succumbing to his wounds, Morpurgo tells us, "At that moment, his soul left his body, soaring heavenwards on its way to everlasting glory." Hudson's translation, which I think, for all its merits, is the closest to the original, reads like this: "The soul flew from his breast seeking righteous judgment," while Heaney's version, by contrast, is more suggestive of that warrior code and its own particular reward, likely Valhalla or a precursor to it. His soul fled from his breast to its destined place among the steadfast ones. Both Heaney and Hudson offer a more overt attempt to mirror the conventions of the original poetry. We see that quite strikingly when Beowulf tells his father-in-law Hygelac of his adventures in Denmark. Morpurgo's effort looks like this, while Hudson and Heaney are clearly trying to represent the caesura and form of the original verse. Additionally, you can see in the three extracts that again Morpurgo links to Christianity, while both Hudson and Heaney do not. Instead, they link back to the warrior's code and the pre-Christian belief in a preordained fate. "I hewed off both their hideous heads, made an end to that family of monsters, slew the last of Satan's children, and brought peace again to Hrothgar and the Danish people. I severed the head of Grendel's mother with a giant sword there in the war hall, taxed to the limit, and made off with my life. Death hadn't marked me, and a kinsman of Hilfane, guardian of men, once more gave me magnificent treasures. I beheaded Grendel's mother in the hall with a mighty sword. I barely managed to escape with my life. My time had not yet come, but Halfdane's heir, the shelter of those earls, again endowed me with a multitude of gifts." It is this predestiny that drives the pagan text, and it is always bubbling away beneath the Christian overlay. Hrothgar's great hall is not even built when Heaney and Hudson tell us its fate is to house violence, hatred and fire. Beowulf lays aside his weapons to face Grendel hand to hand. He doesn't so much as put his faith in God as accept that whatever the outcome is, it is what is right. The acceptance of the fate, what the Anglo-Saxons called weird and the Norse called the Norns, was the normal cause and effect of things. It at times inspired a pessimistic whatever will be attitude, but it also backed up the warrior code. Facing your fate bravely and with honour was all that could be asked of a fighting man. And in the early going, Beowulf is a fighting man. His laying aside his weaponry before brawling with Grendel is either brave or foolhardy, depending on your point of view. Yet there is already a subtlety and understanding about him as a character. Hrothgar was his father's protector in his lowest moment. That familial debt is key to a culture whose ancestry was their identity. We see this in the first 4 or 5 stanzas where the poet tells us of the 4 generations of Hrothgar's family that have preceded him, and when Beowulf crosses the sea to rid Heorot of Grendel, it is in part to repay Hrothgar for the kindness showed his father-in-law, and in part for the glory. Beowulf's exchanges with Hrothgar's wife serve to show there is more to Beowulf than mere brawler. After returning to the Geat court, he steps forward to tell his lord of his adventures, and plays the part of retainer with great honour, ascribing both glory and treasure to his lord. When he interrupts his account of his adventures to consider the fate of Hrothgar's daughter and her marriage to Ingeld, is a sophisticated moment of intertextuality. The Saxon audience would know the story of that troubled marriage, and the episode, which is cut from Morpurgo's text, would show that, if his trip to Denmark was rash, Beowulf has returned with a new, thoughtful maturity. He is now ready to be a king, but resists the suggestion, showing once again his honour. It is interesting as well that the account of Hrothgar's ancestry includes another figure called Beowulf, but all 3 of these versions change that. Heaney and Hudson rename him to Beo, presumably to avoid confusion, while in Morpurgo's much shortened account of Hrothgar's ancestry, he skips that generation entirely. Then the Lord Hrothgar came to the throne, son of the old king Healfdene, great-grandson of Shield, and he was to become the greatest warrior king of them all. Yet the presence of the previous Beowulf is integral to the themes of the poem, the importance of ancestry and the continuing circular nature of fate. We see this when the in-text Skald recounts the events in Finnsburg, excised by Morpurgo again. It's the continuing feud of the Danes in this episode that mirrors events happening on the fringes of the text, the preordained end of both Hrothgar and Hygelac to foreign aggression, the continuing cycle of violence that Beowulf remarks on shortly after. It is always better to avenge dear ones than to indulge in mourning. For every one of us, living in the world means waiting for our end. Again, the suggestion of waiting for our end returns to the importance of fate while reinforcing its role in the warrior's code of conduct. Yet it also returns to the events of the poem to date. Beowulf is about to face his fate again, to duel with Grendel's mother who, while portrayed as a monster and aggressor, is, as Beowulf himself states, merely avenging the violence done to her own dear one. The monsters of Beowulf are a surprisingly human bunch. Like the humans, they have their own motivations, their own nature or character. When Hrothgar tells Beowulf about the king Heremod, who hoarded his treasure and in the process dishonoured his own men, his greed left him a pariah, and in the end he suffered for having plagued his people for so long. This story, part of Hrothgar's lengthy discourse on the dangers of power, is dramatically shortened in Morpurgo's book, and becomes therefore so perfunctory as to be better cut entirely. Yet the Heremod story foreshadows the book's finale, as well as adding its allegory. Dragons have rarely, if ever, been insignificant figures in literature. The term "a dragon to slay" appears often enough as metaphor to prove that. Here, though, the dragon mirrors Heremod, another part of the continually revolving circle of fate. The dragon, like Heremod, becomes a scourge on the land, hated and reviled, and keeping its hoarded treasure selfishly. Facing this as an old man, Beowulf feels that his fate is near, as Hrothgar did when the 2 men parted, and as with that episode, the old man faces his fate with a faithful, brave and loyal retainer, Wiglaf, who will do for Beowulf what he in turn did for Hrothgar, completing another circle within the circle, youth, as it always does, succeeding the aged. The dragon represents the dark side of Beowulf's character, that aspect that all kings must continually battle, lest they too gain Heremod's reputation. He fights human nature his entire life, and dies bravely in his greatest battle rather than succumb. Beowulf is remembered by his people as a friend and hero, a kindly and benevolent king. Yet his people face a nervous future as invaders, strengthened by their loss, look on as they did indeed to Hrothgar and Hygelac in the past. The fate goes on and on. Like Beowulf in his pomp, Wiglaf will be the one to face it most bravely. In truth, with as much character development as we see from Beowulf, with its intertextuality backing up its commentary on life, ancestry and fate, the diverse voices of its distinct characters, Beowulf would be a sophisticated piece of prose in any era. As verse it becomes even more so, matching the needs of its storytelling with the demands of metre and alliteration. Hudson's text is most faithful to the original Anglo-Saxon structure, while Heaney concerns himself more with the alliteration, as we can see in the first handful of lines of the poem. We have heard of the Speardanes in earlier days, of a lineage of kings who accomplished high deeds, how the noble ones excelled in valour. So, the Speardanes in days gone by and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of these princes' heroic campaigns. Hear and listen well, my friends, and I will tell you a tale that has been told for 1,000 years or more. So we can see that Heaney's alliteration, which he describes as varying from shadowy to the substantial, finds the middle ground between Hudson's and Morpurgo's, even in the first few lines. Throughout the poem, it imbues Heaney's text with a high degree of vibrancy, as does his playing with the metre, shortening his half-lines at times to heighten the tension, crashing his phonemes together like the weapons themselves. It becomes almost onomatopoeic. Coupled with some striking pathetic fallacy during the Finnsburg episode, Beowulf's many strengths as a poem add up to a remarkable achievement. Of the three texts, I think all seek different audiences with a degree of success. Morpurgo's lighter offering is a decent effort at turning Beowulf into a story for those not long into the world of independent reading, but the changes he's made perhaps don't go far enough or are slightly harder to justify. I think then it's more likely parents will be buying this, hoping children will develop a taste for the genre rather than children selecting it for themselves. My paperback version has enough about it to suggest a hardback, full-coloured version at twice this size would be a far nicer product as well. As it is, it's hard to look on illustrations like this, barely more than a dark smudge really, and feel anything of the grandeur of the world, real or mythic, that the adventure takes place in. Hudson's text is a more literal translation, and while these cheap reprints are usually to be avoided, this one includes his considerable notes on the translation process, the text itself, and details of the poetry of the time. This extra textual information takes up perhaps half of this volume, and if you are studying the text for university, that probably makes this a useful purchase. However, Heaney's text is the most readable and engaging, which was his stated aim in the beginning of the writing process. He has succeeded ably in that regard. His introduction covers some of the same information that Hudson's notes also provide, but it is his powerful, energetic retelling of the poem itself in all its glory that makes it worth your time and money. So thank you for watching all the way to the end. As I tend to do when these videos get a bit long, and this one I assume by this point probably has, I've got a little bit of a reward for you. I taught this text as poetry in school, and when I did, to make it a little bit more accessible, I did some cartoons in the style of Among Us to show the kids the plot, and I'm going to put them up now at the end for you to enjoy, because I know that everybody really loves the little doodles that I do occasionally in these videos. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.